Has Ayn Rand impacted your life? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we talk about the impact that Rand had on our lives. Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as most of you know, brings you the libertarian principled case for the free society. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Great to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. I would invite you all to come to fff.org to see about 30 years worth of principled articles on libertarianism, the free society, and to subscribe to our YouTube channel and get notices of videos that we do, including here at the Libertarian Angle. All right, Richard, over the many years that you and I have been doing this show, I don't think we've ever discussed a person who has had a huge impact on both of our lives, and that's Ayn Rand. You know, in previous shows, I've talked about how I discovered libertarianism. There were 4 little books when I was a young lawyer in my hometown of Laredo, Texas, that I discovered in the Laredo Public Library that really were the road to Damascus experience for me. And those had been published by the Foundation for Economic Education some 20 years before. And when I read those books, the scales just started dropping from my eyes. But actually, it was Rand who dropped the seeds in my mind that set the foundation for this road to Damascus experience a few years later. What happened was that I was in law school at the time, and I had to drop out of law school to go to 3 months of active duty at Fort Benning, Georgia, to do infantry training. And this was part of my reserve commitment. So when I got out of there, it was about the end of September. And so I still had, or maybe mid-October, I still had a couple of months before I went back to law school in January. So I went to Dallas to wait tables. And so I got a job in a restaurant there, which entailed lunches and dinners. And so I had my afternoons free. And so in the afternoon, I was watching a movie series. I think it was called Bowling for Dollars or something on the local station. And lo and behold, one day they feature this film called The Fountainhead. And so I start watching this movie, and I'm just transfixed. I mean, this is with Patricia Neal and Gary Cooper, and I'm just enthralled by this movie. I mean, I'm just sucked into it, and I just started admiring Gary Cooper, Howard Rourke, and I forget what her name was. Dominique. And so I end up watching this movie, and then at the end of the movie, it says, based on the novel, The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. So I go out and immediately buy the novel and just absolutely love it. But it never occurs to me to go out and look for other books by her. So from then on, it was a remarkable book. I loved it, The Fountainhead, and the movie. But so I just continue going through law school, and then I get back to Laredo to practice law in my hometown. And a good friend of mine who I'd grown up with in elementary school and junior high and high school, who had gone to the Wharton School of Finance and who had also returned to Laredo at the same time, we were the same age, he gives me a book called A Time for Truth by William Simon, who was, I think, Treasury Director at the time. And I read this book and I find it mildly interesting, but I can't figure out why he's talking about, restoring liberty in America and how liberty's been destroyed. And I told my friend, I said, it's an interesting book, but this is kind of weird stuff where he's talking about, restoring liberty to America, and when we all know we're free in America. So, I mean, I was the classic example of the indoctrination of public schooling, of, where they indoctrinate us all into thinking we live in a free society. And then it was sometime after that, I don't know what the time period was, that then I discovered these 4 little books that all of a sudden just enabled me to achieve this breakthrough that we don't live in a free society. We've been lied to. We've been indoctrinated. but it was really Rand and then Simon that set the foundation for that breakthrough. And so I owe a deep debt of gratitude to Rand. Now, interestingly enough, I might have, if I had taken advantage of the opportunity, discovered Rand and libertarianism long before. Because when I was in junior high school, a friend of mine, a girl, said, "Hey, I got a great book to recommend to you. It's called Atlas Shrugged." And I said, "I'm not interested." And so I just, kind of dissed her. Well, if I had just listened to her, and ironically enough, she ended up marrying this friend of mine that gave me the book, Time for Truth. So you got these little interesting connections. And then later, of course, I discovered, after I discovered those 4 little books, I came across Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which was just a book that I absolutely was enthralled by. I mean, I've read Atlas Shrugged about 3 times. And Rand had a tremendous impact on my intellectual development. Now, I never got into objectivism, and I was a Christian, so her atheism didn't appeal to me. But in terms of her concept of individualism and her principled approach to freedom had a remarkable impact on my life. How about you?
Well, my path was a little different in that I became a libertarian the day I was born. The doctor picked me up by my little feet, turned me upside down, and slapped my tiny bottom. And I shouted out. And I realized at that instance that he had violated the non-aggression principle because he had hit me without my consent. It's okay if you had my consent, but I wasn't into kinkiness at that age. So, but this was terrible. Seriously, well, that's bad. Okay, but seriously, it all happened when I was a teenager. Why are you interested in something? It's hard to say or when it starts. But when I was in I'd say even my sort of early teens, 14, maybe 15, certainly, I was very interested in politics and current events. Now, I had a job. I was living in Hollywood, California. My family was in Hollywood, California. And I went to school, but I had a part-time job after school at the Hollywood Public Library. One of my responsibilities was to take care of the magazine collection. It was a beautiful old-fashioned Art Deco library, which unfortunately burned down at some point. It's no longer there, but it had a balcony, and that's where the magazine and journal collections were. And part of my job was to keep them current. New issues come in, you put the new issues on the right places. Someone asks to see an issue, you return it when they have finished with it, that type of thing. And I would finish my 4 hours of work in about 2 hours or so. And I would just sort of hide on the balcony and read political and history publications. So, and this was causing a lot of conflict in me because on the one hand, I would read liberal or left of center publications, The Nation, The New Republic, and they would be saying, social justice, caring for the poor, the callousness of capitalism. Oh, there ought to be a law. And then I would be reading what were the handful of conservative publications at that time, National Review, Human Events, and they offered a totally different position. It costs too much, it doesn't work, and those damn commies seem to kill a lot of people. Oh my gosh, my heart, my head, I don't know what to do. So this is my dilemma. And so one day I had been in a used bookstore on Hollywood Boulevard buying nerdy books. And one of them was a book on totalitarianism. So I was walking home and I stopped at a restaurant that was at the corner of Hollywood and Vine. It no longer exists, long out of business, replaced with another establishment. It was called Hody's, H-O-D-Y''S, Hody's. And they had booths, but they also had a counter with stools. And the booths were taken, and I just was going to have a Coke before going home. So I sat down on an open stool between these two guys. And I pull out this book. I still remember what it was. It was in a collection of essays edited by a famous, of that time, political scientist named Carl Friedrich on totalitarianism. And so I'm flipping through the book, and one of these guys sort of is looking over my shoulder and he says, well, what is that book about? Well, big government and tyranny. And so the other one on the other side of me says, well, what do you think of that book? Well, yeah, I've been reading, those commies seem to kill a lot of people. So the other one says, have you ever heard of Ayn Rand? And I said, well, I've heard of the Rand Corporation. What's an Ayn? And so they said, well, she's a writer and blah, blah, blah. And so they start talking about her and her ideas in relation to this book I had bought. And then one of them pulls out of his pocket a paperback copy of Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And he says to me, we would like you to read this book and come back in 3 days. Read a book and come back in 3 days? Okay, so I'm a nerd. I'm interested in this stuff. So I go home and I absorb it. What is capitalism? The persecuted minority of big businessmen, the mythologies of the Industrial Revolution, the errors of compromise, the importance of principles, all this stuff. So I come back in 3 days and I hand back the paperback book. And this was great. And we talk about it for a while. And then the other one pulls out a paperback out of his pocket. And this one is The Virtue of Selfishness. We want you to read this and come back in 3 days. Okay. So now I'm reading about the right of the individual to his own life. He should not be viewed as an altruistic, sacrificial animal to the tribal wants of others. And then her essays applying this in various ways. The error of collectivist rights, the importance of limited government, and so forth. So I come back, and I'm really hooked on this. And so we talk further, and then one of them pulls out this paperback copy of Atlas Shrugged. My heart sinks. I know they're going to say 3 days. This is like over 1,000 pages. The other one says, we want you to read this book and come back in 10 days. I wiped the sweat from my brow. But anyway, I did go home and I read Atlas Shrugged. I read Galt's speech, the 60-page speech, after finishing the novel once. I read it 3 times. This is it. This is it. This is great. So I go back and we chat more at the same Hodie's restaurant at the corner of Hollywood and Vine. And they said, well, she has other books. And besides that, once every couple of weeks, there's a place right here off Hollywood Boulevard where they offer taped lectures on her philosophy. Taped lectures? Would you like to go? Yeah, I'd like to go. Well, it's next Thursday or Wednesday or whatever the hell the date was. And I started attending those. And so, it would be from, now this was based upon the old Nathaniel Branden Institute, which was in New York. And there were lectures by Nathaniel Branden, his wife, Barbara Branden, Ayn Rand herself. And so, the old-fashioned reel-to-reel recorded, tape recorders. And there'd be a break halfway through the session, get a cup of coffee, go to the restroom. But there was also a bookshelf, books suggested by Ayn Rand and the Objectivist and the Nathaniel Branden Institute. And so that's how I started reading other books. What was I reading? Well, Ludwig von Mises, his books were there. Herbert Spencer, Man versus the State. William Graham Sumner, What Do Social Classes Owe to Each Other? Obviously, Henry Hazlitt books, Economics in One Lesson, What You Should Know About Inflation, et cetera, et cetera. Menger, Böhm-Bawerk, and so on. So I started absorbing all of this as well. And then not too long after that, I guess about 1.5 years later, it was getting to be a holiday time, and I was living in Los Angeles, but I had family in New York, particularly my grandmother, who I had been close to. And so I decided to go, I'd saved up, I had a part-time job, I was saving my pennies. So I decided to go to New York and see my grandmother. And since I was in New York, and there was the Nathaniel Branden Institute, I decided to go there a couple times. So I did. I went to some lectures. They had a social night. And on the social night, people would get together. They'd have entertainment. They'd actually have dancing. In a side room, you could play capitalist board games like Monopoly. Yes, they did. You played Monopoly at the Nathaniel Branden Institute. And so Ayn Rand was there that evening with her husband, Frank O'Connor. and I still remember it unbelievably vividly. She was dressed in a red denim, sort of railwayman outfit with like an old-fashioned railway conductor's cap. And for the older listeners and viewers, her husband was dressed in a Nehru suit with beads. I never understood how or why. But anyway, a group of us, surrounded her, and she very kindly take a half hour, probably a little bit more than that, to just talk with us and answer our questions. And she's often been portrayed by the people who knew her that she had dark eyes and that she'd look right at you, both while she was answering your question and listening to what you had to say. Absolutely true. It's like she was right through you. And she spoke with a calm, deliberative certitude that, this is reality, and this is the nature of man, and these are the rights that logically follow. And why should we expect or want government to do anything but secure these rights and not violate them? And this is the great crime that individuals are denied their liberty and made to believe that they are altruistic sacrifices for the tribe or the collective. So obviously this was a momentous, event in my life. And from there on, I then kept reading all of her works until she passed away. Obviously, long after also the Nathaniel Branden Institute, for its own reason, had gone into demise. And I can honestly say that as much as I have been influenced by and over the decades have discovered and learned from a lot of strands and variations on the individualist and freedom theme, I probably would not be the person that I am today, for good or ill. I wouldn't be the person that I am today, certainly intellectually, philosophically, if it had not been for her. She made me see the world through a totally different pair of conceptual glasses, from which I've never been able to move away since. Because once you appreciate the ideas, the moral, the philosophic, the political, and the economic profoundness of the right of the individual, and the dangers to him and the good of society properly understood by governments that encroach upon that liberty and presume to make him a slave to the whims and wishes of those in political power. Once you have that view, you can never see the world differently again. And I sort of want to add in that context, the Great Depression and the New Deal changed the entire political terrain of the United States. There had been, maybe not completely consistently, not without contradictions, a healthy and vibrant individualist and classical liberal tradition in the United States before the Great Depression. It had been weakened and watered down in the early decades of the 20th century with compromises that some old-fashioned liberals had made, the growth of socialist thinking and the progressive movement in America. But into the 1930s, and as vocal opponents of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, there were staunch advocates of the traditional American conception of individual liberty, limited government, property rights, and so on. But by the end of the 30s, in the war years, they had dwindled to very few, and the new collectivist and modern interventionist liberal policy perspective dominated the country. Basically, the tradition of older-fashioned American founding individualism, I think, Jacob, can be rightly said to be maybe not dead, but in critical condition. There were advocates who wrote on these things. Take too much time to name some of the ones of that older 1940s and 50s period who I think were insightful and important. But I doubt if there could have been a revival of the individualist, classical, liberal, libertarian tradition in America if it had not been for her novels. Her 1943 novel, The Fountainhead, which first influenced you, and there's most assuredly Atlas Shrugged, which came out in 1957, because this did two things. It made the ideas of freedom available in a popularized form. Who doesn't like to read a good story, a novel? I mean, people are going to pick up a novel a lot quicker than a dusty 1,000-page tome on abstract philosophy. So she chose a medium that would make it approachable to a vast popular audience. And in the midst of this novel, she creates this imagery of the ideas of what it means to be a free man, to be guided by your own reason and thoughts, to not be a slave to others, either psychologically and certainly not politically, and an imagery of where this trend of collectivism, even in a country like America, can and will lead if a philosophic turn away is not made. And if you make this philosophic turn away, in this idea of the people who go on strike around, guided by John Galt, this Galt's Gulch, men of freedom and creativity living in a community of rights and respect for each other. This vision of what a free society could be like. That was profoundly important and inspirational. There have been important thinkers defending liberty, articulating the case for liberty, persuasively making the case for free markets in the post-World War II period. Ludwig von Mises, Milton Friedman, F.A. Hayek. You just go down the list, okay? But what made people maybe want to read some of them was having first read her novels, and then as a complement to that, perhaps her nonfiction works, where she often footnoted people like Mises and Henry Hazlitt and Herbert Spencer and others. So if there is a freedom movement today, it is greatly due to her contributions and creative ability to express them in the fictional novel form. Now, if I can just add one more thing, Jacob. It is not a secret that Ayn Rand is a very controversial figure in the libertarian or classical liberal movement in America for various and sundry reasons. Many libertarians and certainly conservatives are deeply devout Christians, and her very outspoken atheism offends them. She comes across often as in a rhetorical style of dogmatism, which turns some people off. Some people who know her personal life from biographies that have been written about her are put off by her personal proclivities in some ways, if you want to put it that way. But it would be a great crime intellectually. It would be remiss if, when the history of the revival and hopefully the success of classical liberal libertarian ideas is written in the future, when we have triumphed, hopefully, fingers crossed, it will be a crime and deeply remiss if there is not a detailed and long and appreciative chapter to her and her contribution to the revival and the restoration of a tradition of liberty in this second half of the 20th century and now into the 21st.
Oh, that's an excellent account of Rand. Your high school experience was very interesting. I'd like to ask you a question about that. Yeah. Did you ever get any dates in high school?
Well, I also usually point out that, in high school, I was a very lonely guy.
I can't imagine why.
And, you know that you're going to be alone on a Friday and Saturday night. I was so alone when already the girls in high school call you the professor. Oh, that's the kiss of death. I was so alone. It was just sad.
Yeah, no, it's very sad. I get tears in my eyes just thinking about it. But, you mentioned Nathaniel Branden and Barbara Branden, and, I never met Rand, but I had the occasion to meet both the Brandens. We had Nathaniel Branden speak at some FFF events, and a fascinating guy. And, of course, after they broke up that partnership of the Nathaniel Branden Institute, which is composed of Rand and and Brandon, he went off and did psychology work, and some of his great books and deal with self-esteem. I mean, I would highly recommend his books for people that are, interested in that area. And then one time when I was living in Colorado, right after I started the Future of Freedom Foundation, they had a Women in Libertarianism conference in Fort Collins, Colorado. And it was organized by a libertarian woman named Mary Margaret Glenny. And the keynote speaker at that event, which was really well attended, was Barbara Brandon. Well, of course, it wasn't limited to women. I registered for it. And so Mary Margaret says, well, would you mind picking up Barbara Brandon at the airport and bringing her to Fort Collins? And so I had like a 45 minutes or an hour ride with Barbara Brandon to talk to her about libertarianism. And boy, that was just absolutely fascinating. And then in the late 70s, I was into not only libertarianism, but also the hard money movement. Which was very oriented toward Austrian economics and free market economics. I was reading people like Harry Brown, getting all his books and subscribing to Harry Brown's special reports, Howard Ruff, Doug Casey, Mark Skousen, the Aden sisters. And so they had this, and gold was going through the roof there in the late 70s. So it was a very popular thing. And so there was this huge conference in New Orleans called the National Monetary Conference, something like that. And I mean, it was enormous. And so they had panels consisting of like Harry Brown and Doug Casey, moderated by a guy named Louis Rukeyser, who was on mainstream television. And the keynote speaker at that conference, I mean, of all the conferences to choose to go to, it was this one, because the keynote speaker was Ayn Rand. And so I got to listen to her give her last keynote speech, or last speech, public speech, before she passed away. Now, that she's had a tremendous influence, as you know, Richard. But, if you look at some of her interviews on TV, I mean, she could be a very abrasive person. I saw her do one interview, and she had the whole audience with her at the beginning. And by the end of the interview, it was like she had alienated everybody. I mean, she really needed to read Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, because from a personal standpoint, it was just difficult sometimes to become a follower of her philosophy. But in terms of the power of her books, I mean, to me, she's just unmatched. I mean, maybe Mises has had a bigger influence, but the power of Rand's concept of individualism and the businessman is being heroic, of providing goods and services to people, the role of the entrepreneur, of taking risks and benefiting mankind by inventions and risks that the entrepreneurs and businessmen were taking, I think is just unmatched. And then in the late 80s, I remember that people started going in search of a movie that had been made of one of her novels, We the Living. Yes. And they went out and did this extensive search and finally found it. I think they found it in Italy somewhere. Yes. And I mean, this is a movie that condemns totalitarianism and collectivism, and it somehow got past it was done in the 40s, and it got past the fascist censors. And I would highly recommend that movie. I mean, the movie is just beautifully made.
If I can just add to that, yeah. It was made in Italy during the Second World War and approved by the fascist censors. It starred Rossano Brazzi, who was a very famous Italian actor in the post-war period, did movies with John Wayne and many other people, Michael Caine. And he plays the male hero in her story. And then an actress named Valli, V-A-L-L-I, plays the main female character, the heroine, if you will. She went on to play in such movies as The Third Man with Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten, for instance. But now the fascist censors approved the making of this film, this movie version of We the Living. It's her first novel. It's set in Petrograd in the years immediately after the Russian Revolution, and it's the story of a young woman who's a student there. It's basically, in my opinion, Ayn Rand's most human novel, because it's derived from her own experiences. She was born in Russia. She lived through the Russian Revolution and the then following Civil War, attended the university, earned her philosophy degree there. So it's really her most human novel because it's basically a story of her experiences fictionalized into a dramatic story. The novel was seen as very obviously anti-communist. Problem is that I've read some accounts, is that the movie gets released in Italian theaters in World War II. And the problem is people were coming, because the fascists had a secret police and, informers, what are the people thinking? And people coming out of the theaters and they said, yes, it was a great movie. But, it's sort of like what we have here under fascism too. And so that's not what the authorities wanted to be the audience conclusion. So I understand the movie ran for only a short time. It was released maybe 15, 20 years ago, dubbed with subtitles on a DVD. So one can get a DVD of it, or it might even be available on one of the sites streaming.
Yeah, no, it was a great movie. And of course, they later did a movie more recently of Atlas Shrugged. It certainly didn't hit any type of popular acclaim, but it was a fairly good rendition of the novel. But I don't think they did the novel justice. I mean, there's just something about that novel. I mean, who is John Galt? It was a mystery. Like you're sucked in right at the beginning. Who is John Galt? And there you have people repeating that term. Who is John Galt in the first half of the book? Right. And it gradually comes into where the answer is revealed. Who is John Galt? And you've got John Galt's monumental speech, as you said, 100 pages or something. But once you start reading Galt's speech, you can't stop reading it. I mean, it's just this paean to individualism and the power of the individual, and why people exist to develop themselves, to serve themselves, to become whatever they were meant to be, as compared to existing to serve the government, serving the greater good, which is what collectivism was all about. I mean, I don't think there's any rendition that anywhere that gives a better explanation of the right of the individual to live his life the way he chooses, and the benefit that this provides mankind than Atlas Shrugged.
Yes, and I mentioned her other novel, early novel. It's really a novelette. It's an extended short story, and she found a publisher for this in the 1930s, and it's basically her anti-utopian novel. It is in a future in which people have no names, they have numbers, and basically the state surveillance is everything. And the main character finds this ruins of the earlier world before the triumph of collectivism. A private home, your own space, privacy. And this is the theme of the individual escaping from the collectivist future and trying to find his own individuality. And it is an anti-utopian futuristic novel. And that too is very impressive and is actually a very easy read.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll wrap it up, Richard. We're out of time. Greatly enjoyed this conversation. And again, if you want to know more about this principled case for liberty that we present at FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. We've got decades worth of solid libertarian articles and videos and conferences and so forth. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, get notice of these kind of videos. And Richard, greatly enjoyed the visit and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, joining us.